Hello everyone. Today we want to talk a bit about the topic of restraint in the context of the gradual training, where to apply it, and how it, for example, relates to the taming of the mind, and how it relates to the topic of impermanence more. But without further ado, let us start. But before we do anything else, I want to apologize for my voice. I stopped recording videos in advance, and I'm a bit sick, so it might fail me a bit during the video. Anyway, first, as I like to start most videos, I want to highlight how the topic of restraint is usually understood. There are at least two types, and when you have a look at the suttas, there is a type of restraint, for example, that is dictated by rules. So when someone is nuligan force, as the suttas say, or someone, even a lay follower, if they just recently started practicing the Dhamma, they should abide by a certain kind of restraint that is dictated by the precepts, by the 5 precepts, preferably by the 8 precepts, or even the 10 precepts if you can do it. And if you are a monk or a nun, then you additionally oblige by the various different rules for monks and nuns. There are a lot of them, and they are differing in the terms of severity. Some of them you do not even need to confess them, like the rule about taking garlic or something like that. Those are kind of meaningless, and probably the first ones that you could drop, since you do not even have to confess them if you did by accident take garlic or eat something with garlic or something like that. And then there are other rules that are much more essential. The Buddha usually only introduced new rules when they became necessary. So the entire Vinaya is basically filled with origin stories of how those rules for monks and nuns came to be. And you can also have a look at various different schools of Buddhism that coexisted and how their Vinayas have developed over time. So if you try to find the common ground between all of them, then you can kind of estimate the age of those rules and determine which of those likely date back to the original rules mentioned in the Pali Canon and which came later. But the gist of it is kind of the same. You want to create boundaries for the mind that you do not want to cross under any circumstances. So whenever you want to practice restraint based on those rules, you have no idea what you are actually looking for yet. So you want to restrain the behavior of the wild mind that you have, but as of right now, you do not even see your mind. And as you do not see it, and do not really know how to train it, at least experientially, based on experience, as in having actually trained it, having actually started to discern the mind correctly, only based on that can you practice restraint, as it's sometimes mentioned later in the gradual training. This beginner kind of restraint is strictly based on rules. For example, the 5 precepts are rules that should not be broken under any circumstances. Your mind will try to find justifications under which circumstance it is fine to break those rules, etc. But you still want to be as firm as you can in your determination to actually abide by those precepts, stick to those precepts, and practice them to the fullest extent. You essentially want to restrain the wild behavior of the mind to a degree where it starts to rebel, where it starts to no longer have any vices to let out the built-up pressure, so to speak. You want to remove as many of the copes of the mind as you can, so that you come closer and closer to the actual suffering that is mentioned in the suttas, so that you can actually understand it better. Because to understand suffering, you have to be able to sit with it. And to sit with the suffering requires suffering to actually be there. When you always act out of any sensuality impulse immediately, you kind of make the suffering go away. Well, it kind of only charges up so it can come stronger next time. But for the moment, you have removed it. And this is what we try to avoid. We actually want to sit with our suffering. This is one of the jobs of the practice of restraint. And then there is another, let's say a bit later, but much more important part of the practice of restraint, which is to make the problem of impermanence much more visible to the mind. The problem is we can always keep telling ourselves little stories about how we are actually fine with impermanence and how there's no problem with it. How we could just die and we're fine with it at any given moment. Loved ones, losing them, doesn't really matter. But when the situation actually hits us, then we are very much affected by it. And now you can ponder a bit and think about how the practice of restraint makes this let's say, problem of impermanence, is a problem of change, the problem of things changing without your consent, more visible and more direct to you. Because that is essentially what the practice of restraint does. It makes the problem of impermanence immediate. If you truly could give up something right here and now, or in the future, as you tell yourself likely, then there should be absolutely no problem giving it up right now. And this is what restraint does. There is a behavior that you kind of cherish and value, because if you would not value it in the slightest, then you would not do it. So you try to figure out those behaviors and then restrain those actions. And if you are truly fine with it, with the impermanence of things, then there should be no problem at all, no lamenting or speaking up against you of the mind when you actually start restraining those behaviors. The mind would be fine with it. It would be pliable, and there would be no problem whatsoever with it. But it's very likely that there is, in fact, a problem. Most people are not willing to give up living at home in a house, for example. Most people are not willing to give up their comforts. Most people are not willing to give up their loved ones, their possessions, their status, their titles, their fame, if they have some, their money. All those things they are not really willing to give up. They are not treating them as borrowed goods, as an example. They are treating them as their own possessions. And once those are challenged by the prospect of impermanence, which is made very immediate by the practice of restraint, then you see how the mind is really faring when faced with the immediate prospect of losing everything or losing certain things that are very dear to the mind. And this is the training that you want to undergo. Bit by bit, you are removing those dependencies of yours that you have built up over time. You are repaying your central debt so that you do not have to do it later. This practice of restraint makes the problem of impermanence very immediate to the mind. Then it has to deal with it. Then you will see if the mind is actually fine with losing things, as in fine with impermanence, fine with non-control and all the other things that the suttas mentioned, or if there is something more to do. And chances are quite good that there is a lot more to do that we are still hiding from ourselves. This is what the mind does best. It is acting out of the dark, so to speak. It is always trying to act within the hidden and present you only with those things that it wants you to see. In a sense, it is kind of tricking you. You cannot trust your own mind, as the Buddha said in, for example, the simile of the empty village, or where the Buddha explained that craving is actually a hired murderer, or that your own mind is a hired murderer, or that you should treat it as such, because it will try to trick you into doing what it wishes for. It will try to trigger you into craving. And this is a problem. But the problem is also that impermanence is quite a distant thing. You do not really experience it right now. I mean, you can have a look at a mountain and see how it erodes away. You can have a look at various different things. You can even try to imagine your own death and the impermanence of your own body. But it always is, or usually is, something that happens to a future you, so to speak, that is very much in the future and doesn't really affect you right now. And only through the practice of restraint can you come closer to making the mind accept this truth of impermanence. Because it's not so much about you accepting it. The mind has to get the message. And for the mind, the training and taming has to be very direct. Otherwise, it won't get the message. You really have to have it touch the hot stove and burn itself so that it will actually shriek away, really move away as soon as the prospect of craving or sensuality comes up, or something that has previously triggered sensual behavior. So the mind has to get the message. Not so much that you have to get it, but you have to make the mind understand. And for this very targeted training of the mind, you obviously need the ability to see the mind, which is a right view. Since most people do not have that, their training first has to revolve around all the rule keeping and to clarifying what the mind actually is, to clarify what craving actually is, what motivations are, what intentions are. And those are all words for kind of the same thing. So you want to clarify that. You want to clarify what the actual problem is, where the actual suffering lies. You want to outline where the mind is, what it actually is, and only then can you proceed with your training in a much more targeted manner. This is the core ability that you actually need for proper restraint, the restraint of the noble ones, one could call it. Any other kind of restraint that is still revolving around rules and precepts and all those things is limited but necessary. So the virtue of the noble ones goes much deeper than the virtue that anyone else can practice. Anyone else is still tapping around in the dark. They do not really know what they are restraining there. Well, they might have a good idea, and certain things are usually recognized as unskillful, as an example, and as not so good. But overall, the overarching theme is that there's something missing, that they are still tapping in the dark, which is why the Buddha always compared the arising of the right view with someone who is in the dark, and then there's a light so that they can see shapes and forms in the dark. So this is what you try to achieve through the practice. This seeing, the ability to see your mind. And then based on that, you can practice restraint and then make the problem of impermanence a very immediate one for the mind, so that it actually learns how to deal with it. We actually want to dig up all those instances where you think that you are fine with the impermanence, but actually you very likely are not. So you have to make it an immediate experience of loss. And only when that is completely fine with you, then you can be fairly certain that the mind has been tamed to a sufficient degree. But even then, you have to be very careful, because the mind usually retreats to a slightly higher level, and it starts telling you other stories on a different level, which makes it very hard to tame it, because it's so difficult to see. In the end, the Buddha even said that it's fairly easy to give up an attachment for the body, and that wanderers of other sects can do that. But getting over your mind, getting over the detachment to your own mind, is so freakishly difficult, because you have been living with your mind for such a long time. And it's not something that you even see, due to it being so very close to you. So you have to be very careful there. And this retreating of the mind has to be foreseen. So you want to learn how to actually be absolutely certain what to look out for. Namely, the own mind, the impulses that trigger you into action. And you want to make sure that there are no blind spots hiding anywhere. And restraint, even if you are a Sotapanna or not, always helps you to get there, because it always makes the restraint, the problem of impermanence, immediate. It shows you what impermanence actually means, as in you have to lose something at some point, and restraining yourself makes you lose it right now. If you are totally certain that you are fine with losing it in the future, then you should be absolutely certain with losing it right now. This is what restraint does. But yet again, there are certain kinds of behaviors that you cannot just stop. You cannot, for example, stop eating, or stop living somewhere warm, otherwise you will just die if you're living in a cold place or something like that. Certain things you have to do, or taking medication. And those kinds of training are kind of difficult, because you cannot really be certain that you are doing it for the right reason, that you're actually seeing the mind, that you're actually restraining the right things that deserve restraint, because in many instances, it's not so clear. Certain behaviors are sometimes good and sometimes bad. It depends on your motivation why you do it. It depends on the mind with greed, the mind with hatred, or the mind with distraction or delusion. And only when those impulses are there is it necessary to restrain something. But if those impulses are not there, then there's no restraint necessary, because in the end you have to eat. This is why the restraint or the moderation in eating comes quite a bit later in the practice, when you already got a very good grasp on it. Until then, you can follow basic rules like only eating one meal a day or something like that. But yeah, I think that should be more than enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy what we do here, feel free to like, subscribe, and do the YouTube stuff. And if you're interested in a community of like-minded individuals, feel free to join the Dhamma Discord server. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.